I've been a big fan of Yamaha for over 40 years. I've been working on the water for over 40 years, and I learned at an early age that was the best product out there. And it was really about reliability. A few times in my life that I've gotten away from it for one reason or the other, I've regretted it, and I've always been happy to come right back to it, and I'm thrilled to have Yamaha as our partner now.
Please welcome back to the stage, Shannon Colbert.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you were able to enjoy some lunch while joining some of our virtual breakout sessions with our partners. To kick off our session on maritime transportation and infrastructure, I want to welcome a wonderful ocean champion to the stage. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island is the co-chair of the Senate Oceans Caucus. Honestly, no need to say that, it goes without saying, but the senator has devoted so much of his time and leadership to speaking about these urgent issues when it comes to climate change. I think at some point he had a running list and ticker of every time that he mentioned climate change on the Senate floor, and I hope he's still doing that and might be able to share that with us at a time. But this is really that core conversation that needs to continue to advance. We need to think about how we all demonstrate that type of leadership and accountability for the work that we do to protect our oceans, our coasts, and the people and the economies that rely upon them. His work in the Senate Oceans Caucus has been instrumental in actually driving creative, bipartisan solutions for the challenges facing our ocean. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It is wonderful to be back at CHOW yet again for one of the most fun weeks Washington has to offer. Unfortunately, the air conditions outside are not so great, and I'm told that has something to do with climate change. Couple of things. I'm going to try to move really quickly, so if you're taking notes, pay attention. First thing is, what's a zettajoule? A zettajoule is the unit of heat measure, Joule, with 21 zeros behind it. It is a really big number. The entire consumption of energy by the human species on the planet is 1/2 of a zettajoule, just to give you that scale. And for the price of that 1/2 a zettajoule of energy, we are adding to the oceans 14 zettajoules worth of heat every single year. It is a 30x wrong way leveraging of atmospheric heat into the oceans as a result of our energy choices. So it is a big deal what we're doing to our oceans. Some of the stuff that's happening where we're going to fight back, we have an IUU bill that I hope will get into this year's NDAA to help clean up international fisheries, and we're going to see if we can get the High Seas Treaty passed. The Oceans Package, which was the biggest package of oceans legislation probably since NOAA was established, passed in the NDAA last year. So the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization, is actually a pretty established vehicle for good oceans legislations. We're working on Plastics Save Our Seas 3.0 after the success of Save Our Seas and Save Our Seas 2.0, and that helped inform the recent negotiations in Paris that are leading towards an international ocean plastics treaty in Nairobi that I hope will be very, very strong. And today, along with Senators Padilla and Welch, I filed a shipping fee for carbon emissions of $150 per ton of carbon emitted for any vessel that touches a U.S. port. That's a big deal because shipping is, if it were a country, it would be the 6th biggest emitter. There's a lot going on out there, and it's burning a lot of fossil fuel. And interestingly, in this case, the shipping industry, particularly the international shipping industry, led by Maersk, are actually supportive of this kind of a fee to help them facilitate their transition to cleaner energy. But we can do all of that, and it really isn't going to matter unless we succeed on climate. So here are some of the coming attractions on climate. First of all, I think the IRA will prove to be very effectual. John Podesta is probably the best person on the planet to be implementing the climate provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act. And, you know, trust but verify always. Bureaucracies are slow always. But I think we're in a fairly good position to earn real emissions reductions from the IRA. Next coming up through the methane regulation that's coming through the Environmental Protection Agency is a social cost of carbon. And I'm promised that when that gets through the APA process and into law, that Shalonda Young at the Office of Management Budget will deploy that across all agencies of government, in purchasing, in permitting, in regulation, in fee setting, in licensing, across the board. That will be another very, very powerful market signal, and it starts at $120 per ton. Next up will be a methane task force. Now that we can identify methane leaks by satellite, we should be hitting them right away with either a search warrant or a cease and desist order from whatever agency of government is best positioned to be effectual for that leak. And a National Methane Task Force, I think, will do that. The DOJ has already announced its Department of Justice Methane Leak Task Force, and we're waiting for the announcement of the rest of the government agencies to join. Finally, we got the border tariff coming along. The EU CBAM is coming along. And if we are smart, we will have a border tariff of our own to match the EU tariff, so we don't have to pay the tariff. And what that does is sends an enormously powerful international price signal to other countries, particularly China, which has now become the world's biggest emission emitter. And hectoring them and asking for their cooperation is not going to have anywhere near the effect of a solid tariff on all goods that come in that are made with high carbon emission processes. The last thing I'll mention is we've got the COP coming up. There's a lot going on about why a fossil fuel country is hosting the COP and why it's led by a fossil fuel CEO, and how they're going to distinguish this from other COPs, which have also been heavily infiltrated by anti-climate forces like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And what I've asked them to do, and what I hope they will do, and what I hope you'll encourage them to do, is to say that if you're a company or a trade association or a corporation that wants to attend a COP, you're more than welcome. But you got to bring with you an audited statement of your climate political activities. Because if you're out there trying to sabotage the purpose of the COP, you don't deserve to be at the COP, at least without everybody knowing that on the other side, you're out to sabotage the purposes of the COP. So there's a lot of good stuff that can be done. The urgency is real and immediate, and nobody knows better than scientists and oceans advocates how important this is. So God bless you for this. Happy CHOW, and thank you for having me.
Always. Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. It's always been an honor to have you at CHOW and your leadership. I'd like to take a second to introduce another emerging and great leader. Congressman Robert Garcia is a career educator. He served 2 years as the mayor for Long Beach in California. The Port of Long Beach is the premier U.S. gateway for trans-Pacific trade, and it's a trailblazer in innovative goods, movement, safety, environmental stewardship, as well as sustainability. The port is one of the few U.S. ports that can actually today welcome larger vessels, serving 175 different shipping lines with connections to 217 different seaports around the world. It is truly a large connector and a major, major operation. Congressman Garcia is leading policy efforts to support those clean shipping innovations and the investments in these port cities, as well as in how do we better look at equitable, healthy conditions for those communities. And so please join me in welcoming to the stage Congressman Garcia.
Hey everyone, how are we doing? Good to see everybody, and it's really an honor and a pleasure to be here with all of you, particularly on this day where we're having discussions and honoring the work to save our planet, to particularly the focus on our oceans, our waterways is so critical. And so thank you for being activists and advocates and leaders and organizers in this really important work. So I am a freshman member of Congress. I've only been here for a few months, and it's been an honor to join this great group of other freshmen. I'm also president of our freshman class on the Democratic side of 35 members. And we are here in large part because we can see what's happening around us and recognize that there is a climate crisis that is happening, and that we have to take action and be bold in this moment. I also want to thank the senator that just spoke. He spoke about this idea of a carbon fee as it relates to shipping and emissions, and that is a critical piece that is missing from our policy here in the U.S., and I want to talk about that in just a minute. I also am excited because we, of course, are introducing all of our inaugural legislation as new members. Today, I've also introduced the Clean Shipping Act of 2023. And this is work that's been going on and building for many years, and my predecessor in Congress was critically involved in this work as well. This gives essentially authority to the EPA to regulate carbon emissions in the maritime sector. And on our bill is essentially a carbon intensity standards bill, whereas the bill that was just discussed is a carbon fee. Now, both of these pieces actually exist in the EU, for example, and so they actually work together to really regulate the huge amount of destruction that is happening to our air quality and to our climate because of our shipping industry. Now, a little bit about Long Beach. So Long Beach is a city of about 500,000 folks in California. It's a coastal city. It's a port city, but it's pretty big. It's roughly the same size as Atlanta, Georgia. This is a big community. It's a working class community. And the port and what happens at our ports drives so much of our economy. And so we have the impacts that we see every single day from pollution, what folks are breathing. If you live in the surrounding communities of coastal Los Angeles or Long Beach, San Pedro, Wilmington, that western part of southern western part of the county, your life expectancy is 8 years less than if you just lived 10 minutes down the street along the coast, and because of the intensity of the pollution along the ports. And so these bills that are looking at regulating emissions and the damage caused by shipping, which is a critical part of our economy, are really important. And we are so far behind other parts of the world. So our bill in particular requires the EPA to regulate the carbon intensity of maritime fuels for the first time, consistent with a 1.5 Celsius decarbonization pathway, which is actually set out in the Paris Climate Accords. Now, under our bill, which I'm proud to lead with Senator Padilla in the Senate, and also my neighbor, Congresswoman Nanette Berrigan is our co-lead on this. This gives the EPA the authority under the Clean Air Act to transition to zero-emission fuels by 2040. Now, this is ambitious and certainly is a marker, but as you are all aware, it's also very, very necessary. I also am really grateful that Maersk, if you're familiar with Maersk, they're one of the largest port container companies in the world. They actually are 16% of the cargo market worldwide is Maersk. Maersk has endorsed our bill just yesterday as a leader in really trying to green our seaports. So I'm very grateful to them, because having industry on our side is going to be very important as this bill moves forward. I think it was noted by the senator, but we would, as a shipping industry, if we were a country, our shipping industry here, it would rank 6 of the largest greenhouse gas pollution emitters in the world, our shipping industry. And so we emit more pollution than all of Germany, South Korea, or even around the same as Japan, just by the ship pollution that's happening at our ports. So while we're thinking about oceans and pollution and all that the climate crisis requires, I encourage all of you and implore you not to forget the pollution that's coming out from ports and the shipping industry. This is a very critical piece of our larger discussion and advocacy work. And so I'm really grateful that you're all discussing this today here as well as on this panel. I also just want to note that we have an opportunity with the Inflation Reduction Act, which is essentially the largest climate investment in American history. We have an opportunity with that bill and with bills that are being introduced in the Congress to really make a huge difference and really focus on our needs. And for those of us that are moving towards and believe that we have to move towards a greener economy, these are exactly the kind of bills that we need. I want to say finally, I'm very aware that these types of bills face challenges in a conservative controlled House. And obviously politically, we're going to have some difficulties in this Congress to approve and get some of these bills done. But we're very grateful to kind of set the stage for at least what I hope is winning the House back in 2024, so that we can actually get back to the business of producing and adopting bills and legislation that actually help people, especially communities. These are mostly, at least for my community, around ports. These are oftentimes communities of color, low-income communities that are being devastated by our desire to have large TVs and refrigerators and goods moved to us in a way that's expeditious. And so thank you all for your time. I look forward to getting to know all of you. I'm happy to be here, and it's been a wild few months, but we look forward to the work ahead. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Congressman Garcia. And thank you for the leadership on addressing these critical ocean solutions to address climate change while also bolstering the blue economy and always centering our communities and the health of our communities in the work that we do. For this session, I want to introduce our session moderator, Ingrid Irigoyen. She's the Associate Director for Ocean and Climate with the Aspen Institute. She's the director of Aspen's Shipping Decarbonization Initiative, and she's also the lead facilitator for the Cargo Owners for Zero-Emission Vessels. She partners with leading organizations and companies in order to drive that transition to a zero-emission maritime shipping, and I could not think of a better person to help bring this amazing panel to bear so that we can have an amazing discussion and think about what does the future of maritime transportation and infrastructure truly need to look like, where we already seeing changes led across all different sectors, and where do we still need to go. So with that, I'd like to welcome to the stage the panel, and Ingrid.
Great, hello, good afternoon, everyone. I may start coughing a little bit. Turns out it's a little bit smoky out there. So thank you all for being here today to talk about this important topic that has become, fortunately, a source of optimism lately, the topic of maritime decarbonization. And before we get started with our excellent panel here, I did want to just reiterate thanks to Senator Whitehouse and Congressman Garcia. A lot of the great activity that we see in this space is being led by the private sector, but we absolutely must have supportive public policy, and so knowing that we have champions in Congress for addressing this issue is, of course, very important, and of course we hope that there will be a lot of bipartisan support for that going forward. So my name is Ingrid Irigoyen. As has been said, I lead our ocean and climate work at the Aspen Institute, and that includes a lot of work that we do now regarding maritime decarbonization. We work with cargo owners, and when we use the term cargo owner, for those of you who aren't shipping geeks like us, those are the customers of the shipping industry, the big corporate users of shipping services that bring you all of the stuff that you have and are wearing right now. Mostly has come, unless you're wearing luxury goods, in which case those get flown by air freight. But, most of us are wearing things that came across the ocean. So we work with them. We also do a lot of convening to explore the opportunities and challenges for moving toward a zero-emission maritime future. and a lot of that work is now focused on the United States because there is so much that we can do as a nation, as a maritime nation, and as the biggest importer of goods by sea anywhere in the world. So. It's a pleasure to be here. I also am reflecting on the fact that I believe it's true that this is the first time that this topic has been squarely addressed on the agenda for Capitol Hill Oceans Week. As someone who's been part of the ocean community for over 20 years now, I remember a time when we didn't talk about this issue because it was hopeless. There weren't technology solutions, and there was no point in talking about it, frankly. The industry had nothing to move toward, necessarily. There were some efficiency gains and some little things that could be done. But now we see this tremendous surge of optimism. And it doesn't mean that we have all of the challenges addressed, certainly, by no means. And every technology solution has its downsides, and we're still working our way through that as a community. But there is a lot of hope now. There's a lot of potential. There are some very recent studies by very credible experts that indicate that we can get this industry 1.5 aligned if we pull in the right direction, if we make efforts to address the fundamental problems which are related really to cost and risk. And to address cost and risk, you need private sector leadership, you need civil society engagement, and you need government to help support a transition. So. Pleased to be here at this point in time and talk with this very distinguished panel about an issue that really does impact our daily lives, whether we know it or not. The other thing I wanted to mention is that in the Biden-Harris Ocean Climate Action Plan, this issue is also very well addressed. So if there are any administration people out there, I wanted to salute them for that because that's another sort of sign of hopefulness and optimism that we're hanging on to. Before we get into our discussion with our panelists, and I'll introduce them in just a second, I would remind folks that I guess there are cards that you can put questions on, and you can hand those to Sanctuary Foundation staff down here in the front. So they'll bring questions up if you'd like me to pose a question to our panelists. We'll try to get to them as best we can as time allows. But even if we can't get to your question, I would really like to know what your questions are. So please do feel free to bring them on down. All right, so now I'd love to turn to our panelists. And so we have Shannon Sarkis, who's the Director of Sustainability for Crowley, Commander Laura Springer, who's the Division Chief for the Office of Waterways Management and Policy at the United States Coast Guard, Lee Habeger, who is the Executive Director of the Seafood Harvesters of America, and then Ian Gansler, Manager of Energy, Resilience, and Sustainability Policy at the American Association of Port Authorities. And so what I'll do is go down the line and ask you each to start by telling us a little bit more about the work that your company, your organization, your agency does in this space, and why do you think that this issue is so tremendously important to the United States? The issue of maritime transport and infrastructure and decarbonization of those elements. Maybe I'll start with you, Shannon.
Sure. Hello, I'm Shannon Sarkis, the Director of Sustainability for Crowley. Again, thank you for having us here on stage to discuss this. It's an honor to be here and a part of these conversations. So Crowley is a privately owned and operated U.S. logistics, maritime, and energy solutions company. We primarily operate in the U.S., including Alaska and Puerto Rico, as well as in Central America and the Caribbean. So Crowley has set some ambitious goals around decarbonization as a company. We have a goal of reducing our footprint by 42% by the year 2030 and a net zero goal of 2050. And so my role in the organization as the Director of Sustainability is to help set the sustainability strategy, create pathways towards decarbonization to meet those goals, and engage our employees and our stakeholders in our sustainability journey. So really the importance of maritime, I would be remiss if I didn't speak to the economic impact that the maritime industry has. The industry supports over 650,000 jobs and includes $41 billion in labor compensation annually, as well as produces $150 billion worth of economic input that directly supports the economic resilience of the U.S. Also, maritime transportation is the most efficient transport for moving cargo, but I know Laura is also going to speak to that, so I'll turn it over to her.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Laura Springer. I am with the Coast Guard. Basically, for anyone unfamiliar with the Coast Guard, we're a maritime service and the lead federal agency for mitigating risk in the marine transportation system. We also lead crisis response and safeguard our MTS for our nation's economy by ensuring the uninterrupted flow of cargo throughout our nation's ports. This is accomplished through law enforcement and regulations. Our 11 missions range from marine safety to ice breaking to living marine resources, and the buoys you see out when you're out boating also are our responsibility. We protect commerce through resiliency, response, and unity of effort. If you can see the graphic behind me and you've ever driven on I-5 or I-95, you can appreciate this. 90% of all goods are transported on our safe and secure waterways. One barge alone keeps 134 trucks off the road. So the MTS offers a tremendous value proposition for the transportation of goods. So shipping is the cornerstone of the global supply chain. This system makes sure that our shelves are stocked and people have the goods and services that they rely on. If you look at the marine transportation system as the key component of the global supply chain, you realize that friction and regulations, friction introduced into the system slows it down. As we saw with the global pandemic, the ever-given grounding in the Suez Canal, and various regulatory systems, it slows down the system. Our goal as a regulator is to seek a balance between risks and costs to support the efficient flow of commerce while reducing risk and disruption to the MTS. As regulators, though, we tend to be conservative, but are committed to environmental stewardship. For example, fuel changeovers in the mid-2010s resulted in losses of propulsion, which has the potential to turn into a vessel grounding or a collision, which could result in an oil spill. Today, this is not the case because procedures and policy have been developed to address these fuel changeovers. Implementing these greenhouse gas reduction technologies must be a collaborative process. As we know, shipping is a global industry. Right now, the Coast Guard is at the International Maritime Organization. For those of you unfamiliar with the International Maritime Organization, it's the UN's shipping arm. So shipping is a global industry, and the International Maritime Organization really develops the regulations through treaties, et cetera, that govern how all nations should act on our nation's oceans. So right now, the Maritime Safety Committee is meeting, and the output of this committee will be a regulatory framework for new technologies and alternative fuels for the safe reduction of greenhouse gases. I want to underscore the word safe. Efforts are expected to be completed in 2025. Resiliency, response, and unity of effort are required to address these challenges.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lee Habager. As Ingrid said, I'm the Executive Director for the Seafood Harvesters of America. We're a national commercial fishing association comprised of 20 member groups from around the country, spanning from Alaska to Hawaii to Florida to Maine. We serve as a unified voice for the commercial fishing industry here in Washington, D.C., with policy and decision makers. I think importantly, and thanks to Ingrid and the Aspen Institute for recognizing the commercial fishing industry in this space, we are stewards of our marine resources, and we are committed to not only thriving fishing businesses, but healthy, abundant oceans and coastal communities. And I'm probably a bit of an odd bedfellow here on this panel. Commercial fishing sometimes doesn't fit in with traditional maritime infrastructure and ports. But I think when we're envisioning coastal communities and maritime infrastructure of the future, it's critical to have the commercial fishing industry part of these conversations. Not only do we rely heavily on maritime transportation to help ship our seafood that we harvest in our federal waters here in the US around the country and the world, but we're also direct users of maritime infrastructure, docks, ports, marinas, other maritime infrastructure, processing ports that are right there on the waterfront, fuel, ice. So maybe a little bit different than the Port of LA, perhaps, but still very necessary infrastructure for the fishing industry to conduct our business. The commercial fishing industry is culturally and economically important in many coastal communities. We are woven into the fabric of these very special places. And I think the US has a unique opportunity in this moment in time to continue to be a leader globally in creating a bold new future for the maritime transportation and infrastructure space. This vision, though, must incorporate the commercial fishing sector as an important player, not only in the space, but as users of this maritime infrastructure. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ian. Thanks.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Ian Gansler with the American Association of Port Authorities. We're the nation's trade association for public port authorities with over 80 public port authority members from coast to coast in just about every coastal state and Great Lakes state of the country. Our association has existed for just about 110 years. We've been representing maritime and transportation interests for that long. And it's really a transformational time in the maritime industry, as my fellow panelists have said. We track grant programs and federal funding programs and how much of those programs go to port authorities every year. And in the past several years, frankly, the funding and the support from the federal government has skyrocketed. Between 2014 and 2022, federal support, federal funding for port infrastructure has grown by 423%. And that's largely thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. So as we talk about not only decarbonizing our transportation systems and making them more sustainable, but also ensuring that they remain resilient and can support the American economy, there's never been a better time to be having these conversations and doing this business. As I think we'll delve into more in the conversation, even with these record levels of support, it's still not enough to get to those goals that we're going to talk about. There's about $6 billion from the federal government going to port authorities in terms of infrastructure funding this year. But to reach these really lofty and important goals of decarbonization, there's still a lot that needs to be done. And I think we'll delve into that, as well as the real economic role that ports play in supporting businesses large and small throughout the country.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you all so much for introducing some of those key points. We spent a lot of time reflecting on kind of what happened during the pandemic and that supply chain chaos and how much that really affected all of us. And the importance of the maritime system to our economy, of course, to our environment, and we're here to talk about greenhouse gas emissions, but also the impacts on communities and marine life. And there's so many benefits, as we seek to modernize, digitize that industry to make sure that we have a strong domestic industry going forward is tremendously important to our nation for so many reasons. And looking for those other benefits that we can have while we're modernizing, let's go ahead and address as many of these societal and environmental issues that we can while we're at it. And that certainly is going to need a significant investment from both the public and private sectors. And so before I get into some more detailed questions, and I understand that this topic actually came up during a panel yesterday as well, which is very exciting. So we've made 2 appearances here at CHOW already. But before we get into some of the real details, I did want to, for the sake of our audience, just explain that when we think about maritime decarbonization, we tend to think about it in 2 buckets. There's efficiency, which is tremendously important, and that can be things like filling up a container all the way to the top instead of shipping it half empty. It can be things like monitoring the speed of a vessel so that it arrives just in time instead of racing across the ocean and then sitting in a long line, causing pollution off the Port of Los Angeles. There are a number of things like keeping your propeller clean, and all of that can be supported by regulatory approaches, by incentives, by private sector leadership. And then the other sort of, I think, bigger challenge in many ways is a transition to new fuels and technologies. And so much of, I think, what we'll touch on here today is how can we enable that transition? Because the new fuels and technologies are in some cases significantly more expensive. And like I said in the introduction, none of them is perfect. There isn't one solution that is totally clean, easy, available, scalable, doesn't have other issues, right? There's always a footnote on every single one of them. And so how to move forward with an approach that enables some of those solutions to blossom and come to scale quickly is one of the challenges that we're facing. One of the ways that we're doing that at the Aspen Institute is we've created something called a Zero Emission Maritime Buyers Alliance, where we're actually getting customers of the industry to aggregate demand for zero emission solutions and forward procure zero emission shipping services. That's one way that we hope to sort of catalyze and kickstart. But of course, the need for the public sector to engage and the need for coordination and collaboration among folks like us, I think is, ever more important as time goes on. So to help us sort of better understand this issue, I'd love to, Shannon, ask you a couple of questions, from your viewpoint as a vessel owner and operator. A couple of things that I think might be helpful for our audience. So people may hear a lot of talk about the Jones Act, and I think it would be worth spending a minute just explaining what that is and what implications that has for our nation, how that came to be, and just get us sort of a basic grounding on the importance of the Jones Act to your business. And then talk a little bit about how the bipartisan infrastructure law and the IRA have been able to sort of give us a lot of optimism about alternative fuel development, which I think we see as a pretty significant opportunity for this country. So remember that every cost, one person's cost is another person's opportunity. So we like to think about new fuel production as potentially a significant economic opportunity here. So those laws have given us a lot of hope in that sense, but there may be some mismatch between the fuel production potential and then the actual application of those fuels in reality on the water. So if you could help us unpack some of that, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with the Jones Act. So the Jones Act is also the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. And this act it's a law that requires vessels that operate between two U.S. locations to be built in the U.S., owned by U.S. companies, and crewed by U.S. Marines, or merchant marines. So the benefits of the Jones Act are directly tied to these three requirements. So U.S.-built vessels ensures that we maintain the industrial capacity, the expertise, and the workforce to provide shipbuilding and ship repair on our own shores. It also allows us the opportunity for innovation in shipbuilding space as we look towards the future of fuels and building ships to support a decarbonized economy. For U.S. owned, this ensures that billions of dollars of economic output I mentioned earlier directly contributes to the U.S. economy. And then our U.S. mariners, one of the most important parts. Our U.S. mariners are a highly educated workforce with a high level of technical knowledge. Not only do they support the commercial transportation industry, but they also are a crucial line of defense for our military. They are a ready workforce that allow for the transport of military cargo in both peacetime and during conflict. So as far as the discrepancies between the availability of funds via the IRA and the IIJA and the application of alternative fuels in the maritime industry, really there is two aspects of this. There is a discrepancy between the available supply chain of alternative fuels, specifically for maritime usage, and also a lack of appetite to absorb a green premium in order to build this supply chain. So there are a few things that we can do to help bridge the gap in these discrepancies. One of those things is to revisit the renewable fuels standards. So the renewable fuel standards allows for subsidies for biofuels, but it doesn't include all classes of vessels in these subsidies. So being able to look at the definitions of the classes of vessels that are available will help bridge that gap and start to change that discrepancy to allow for the usage of biofuels for all vessels. Additionally, the RFS doesn't include next generation fuels currently, so including fuels such as renewable hydrogen, methanol, ammonia, that will allow for these next generation fuels to reach cost parity and reduce that green premium. We do have a healthy grant program for the development of alternative fuels. However, a lot of that funding has been absorbed by the aviation industry to develop sustainable aviation fuels. And unfortunately, the development of sustainable aviation fuels does not result in a healthy supply chain for maritime alternative fuels. Let me give an example. So in California, our tugs are currently operating on R99 biodiesel, which allows us to meet the CARB requirements for decarbonization. We would love to run our tugs in Oregon and Washington on R99, but unfortunately there is currently only one producer of R99 biodiesel that meets the safety standards to allow the fuel to be run in tugs in maritime vessels. So additional funding that is earmarked for maritime will allow for that support in the research, development, and deployment specific to maritime alternative fuels.
That's great. Yeah, and that competition with the aviation sector is, that's only beginning. So this is one of the concerns with any biogenic inputs, even the most sustainable ones, is that there just isn't enough Earth to be able to power both of those industries with biofuels in the long run, if we're talking about sustainable biofuels and we're going to feed this human population. So it really is, I think, a really important point. We don't want to be in this kind of competitive stance against another industry. I think to ensure that this industry gets prioritization, so or at least has its own pool to draw from certainly makes a lot of sense to me. All right, so let's talk about the Coast Guard. So Commander Springer, tell us a little bit more about the role that you've described what you do domestically, which is so important to this transition. You also play a really important international leadership role, and would love to hear a little bit more about your role as the head of the U.S. delegation to the International Maritime Organization, and why that matters to us here in this country.
So thank you so much. I'm actually going to have to take a step back and talk about the size of the U.S. fleet in comparison to the rest of the globe. Less than 3% of deep draft commercial vessels are U.S. flag vessels. So that means when I talked previously about regulations, we can control our domestic regulations. If we wanted to create a framework of regulations aimed at our domestic fleet that was traveling deep sea, it would make a small dent in any greenhouse gas emissions. Instead, we work with the IMO, and it's not an easy process. I'm sure if anyone has ever watched C-SPAN or the United Nations, it just moves slowly. But as a key player at the IMO, we're a member of the Maritime Safety Committee, and right now they are hard at work at a regulatory framework for new technologies. And the reason a regulatory framework is so important is it gives guidelines, and also new things that we introduce into the marine transportation system create a new risk profile. For example, I just learned in the 60s, we thought a nuclear buoy was a good idea. We have to be very careful that we're not implementing technologies that are going to have an unintended consequence. If you look back at our regulatory frameworks, the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 and the Maritime Transportation Security Act of 2002 are some of the most expensive regulatory regimes that have been implemented, and both were as a result of a tragedy. So we are trying really hard to be proactive and to be good stewards on the global stage and domestically.
That's great, thank you. So Lee, our strange bedfellow, it's really great to have you here because when we talk about maritime, we often are talking about the movement of freight. But really, the industry that you represent is so important to our nation, as you said, culturally, providing healthy food, and has been on its own sustainability journey for a very long time that hasn't always been easy. And now it is one of many industries globally that will also need to decarbonize. No matter how large or small an industry's footprint is, everyone needs to be part of this movement. And your industry will have some unique opportunities and challenges related to that. So we'd love to so first of all, any comment you'd like to make about how the Jones Act relates to your industry would be, I think, maybe interesting for our audience. But to also tell us about how you see some of this growing technology innovation, the collaboration, this sort of interesting creativity and collaboration that we've seen in the freight side, some of that optimism, how that can translate potentially to the fishing industry, and how some of the challenges that we face on the freight side related to cost and risk also are applicable to you. You're probably hearing questions and concerns from your stakeholders, and we'd love to sort of understand kind of where you all are and what the rest of us can do to help.
Yeah, great question. I have a lot of thoughts on this. I think, first of all, I will just quickly touch on the Jones Act. While the operations of commercial fishing vessels and maritime transportation vessels are very different, our requirements under the Jones Act are the same. So all of our domestic fishing vessels also have to be Jones Act compliant. So everything Shannon said also applies to the fishing vessels all around our nation and in the federal waters. I guess to the second part of your question, Ingrid, I will start by pointing out that Harvesters did a study in 2021. We surveyed commercial fishing industry folks around the country. I will acknowledge it was very heavily weighted to West Coast and North Pacific respondents. But we were looking at what the technology priorities are for the fishing industry. We really wanted to understand from a fisherman's perspective, what technology needs are they seeing a space for on their vessels? What do they need on the water? And one of our top two priorities that were submitted through this survey was energy efficient engines. And so I think that's a really key point here, because there is appetite in the commercial fishing industry to make progress here. Fuel is one of our top two costs, and so if we are able to reduce that cost, whether it's through an alternative fuel, whether it's through electric engines, if that makes sense, that would be a really great win-win for both fishing businesses, but also the environment. So certainly appetite. Ingrid, you alluded to some challenges and barriers that we've seen in other maritime sectors, and I think some of those also apply here. So I think first there's the affordability of new technology. You touched on this, Ingrid. Whether it's new fuels, a new engine design, a new boat design, it will be expensive. And Shannon touched on some of the federal dollars available to help transition. We have programs also available to us. One of them is the Diesel Emission Reduction Act grant program, the DERA program. But we also suffer the same fate that we are competing against other sectors, the trains, buses, freight trucks. And not that we don't want to electrify our school buses and see our trains be more efficient, but it's very difficult for the fishing industry to access that program. There's also the fisheries finance program, but there's sort of a question mark around that now, whether it's going to be considered a harmful fisheries subsidy according to the WTO. So there's really not a lot of great options in terms of federal financial support for the fishing industry in this space. And secondly, we've touched on this as well, but I think there's a problem of accessibility of new fuels and technologies. And in the fishing industry, we have very large fishing ports like Dutch Harbor and New Bedford. We also have very small fishing communities like Rockland, Maine, and Fort Bragg, California, very remote, small areas. And so I think we're going to have to pay attention to how these communities can afford, access, store, and dispense any new fuels that come on the market. Dutch Harbor is a great, huge fishing port, but it is probably halfway out the Aleutian Island chain. So how do we actually get the fuels out there? How do we store them? And how do we safely dispense them? What happens? How does the Coast Guard respond if something happens way far out there? So just thinking about the scalability of the accessibility piece is something that's on my mind. And then I think third, nobody wants to be first. And I think this holds true in a lot of industries, but also in the fishing industry. So, if we go all in on a new technology, we've now invested in a 30 or 40 year asset. And if we get that wrong, that fishing vessel is sort of stuck there, or we're gonna have to retrofit or figure out how to kind of pivot on the fly. And that's difficult. Also, this Jones Act piece, we have to build in the US. And so, I think fishermen are now trying to think about, well, can we pool sort of boat designs, and can 5 of us go to a boat builder so we sort of reduce the cost for all of us? So if we could go down that road and we pick the wrong technology, as Ingrid said, there's a footnote for everything. So I think it's hard to want to be the first person in the fishing industry to go first and be willing to sort of stick your neck out. And then, there is also this piece of insurance. This is a very early data point, but I was speaking with a fisherman out in Sitka, Alaska, who is ready to pull the trigger on an electric engine. So he's checking all his boxes and he's talking to his insurance agent, and they're like, ooh, I don't know how we're gonna insure a lithium battery engine. There is a real risk of a lithium battery fire. And so that's now a barrier for him. He's ready to do it, he's ready to test it, he wants to be on the front lines and pilot this, but there's a question of whether his boat could actually be insured if he puts this engine on. So that's a very practical, kind of nuanced consideration we have to be thinking about, but certainly a very real one in the fishing industry. And I guess lastly, there are so many unknown barriers. I guess that's why we're having this conversation today. We don't know what we don't know, but we are hoping to do some scoping work with the Aspen Institute, Ingrid and Taylor, within the commercial fishing industry to be able to add to this list and start to think about how we tackle some of these barriers and challenges.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, so many challenges that are sort of parallel between the two sectors, and there's, I think, a lot of opportunity to do some cross-learning. And I will say, for those of you who are seafood markets people, and I'm sure there's some in the room here, the early work that was done so many years ago and continues today around buyer engagement and working with the major corporate buyers of seafood to ensure sustainability standards and all of that was actually quite inspirational, very directly inspirational for a lot of the work that we have ended up doing in the maritime space. So I think because of some of those management challenges, the technology challenges, the lack of transparency and the old-fashioned industries and all of these sort of both sort of soft and then concrete sort of hard technical challenges are the same, there does seem to be a really great opportunity to come together and actually move in unison with greater clarity and some coherent strategy. So that's work that we're excited to embark on hopefully soon. So Ian, talk to us about ports. So very, very important. And I think, for many of us, we're confused about ports a little bit because it seems like they have very different roles. Some of them seem to just be landlords. Some of them actually have a lot of regulatory authority. Tell us about those differences and just help us better understand how ports operate differently around the country, what kind of role they can play in decarbonization, given that sort of diversity of powers, if you will. And then tell us about some of the innovations that you're observing among your members as we strive to reduce the climate impact and other environmental impacts and social impacts.
So as I think was mentioned, 90% of all cargo worldwide gets shipped over the ocean, over maritime routes. That means 90% of all goods imported into the United States come through a port authority. So this is absolutely critical infrastructure for the economy. According to a study we conducted a few years ago, over 31 million American jobs are supported by port authorities and over a quarter of the nation's GDP. So just about every business in the country is either importing or exporting something, right? Or using a product that is imported or will be exported. So these coastal locations are absolutely critical to everything in the economy. As you mentioned, some ports are what we call landlords and some are what we call operating ports. What that means is any public port authority is essentially a unit of government. Either it's been established by a local government or a state government as a quasi-public corporation or an actual unit of government. And its job is to be a good steward of that public asset, which is the port and the harbor and the multimodal connections that exist there. What most ports in the country, in the United States, do is follow what's called a landlord model, which means they take the property, they take the harbor and the terminals there, and they rent it out to private companies, which are called marine terminal operators, or MTOs. And MTOs are the private companies that are operating the docks and the cranes on a day-to-day basis. This has a really big benefit for the public. It means the public doesn't have to invest in all of the staff and workforce and planning that it takes to run a terminal on a day-to-day basis. It also means that the private company is investing into the capital of the Port Authority. So the public still gets a return on that investment. The public gets the benefit of having that cargo move through their community, but they have a private partner, a public-private partnership. The minority, but still a substantial number of ports are what we call operating ports, which very simply means the public sector does the operation on a day-to-day basis. That gives the Port Authority a little more control over what type of vehicles should we use in our operations, for example. So both models have their benefits, and it's important whenever you're doing some kind of long-term planning to recognize what is the model in our local community. In terms of innovation, I want to actually start kind of backwards from land, and then let's get out to sea, because ports are multimodal, which means there's more than one mode of transportation meeting at the same point. So whenever cargo is dropped off at a port, it has to leave the port on some other mode of transportation, namely truck or rail. So if we're thinking about mitigating the emissions from a port complex, and you're thinking about trucks, and you want to, say, electrify all of those trucks, all those trucks driving by you on the highway, whenever you see the exhaust coming out of the tailpipe, what if we could eliminate that? Well, those trucks need to charge somewhere. And it's not as simple as, oh, I'm buying a new refrigerator and I plug it into my wall and the electricity's there. Think about, if you're thinking about one of the largest ports in the country, you're gonna have hundreds, maybe over 1,000 trucks coming in and out of that complex on a day-to-day basis. They all need to charge. And it takes an electric heavy-duty vehicle like a truck hours to charge its battery. So this is a significant amount of infrastructure that will need to be put in place to even start that process. When it comes to rail, rail is actually much more energy efficient than trucks. So what many ports are doing is building out more rail connections, building out what's called on-dock rail. So when the rail goes all the way to the shoreline, so when the container comes off, or another type of cargo comes off a ship, it goes directly onto a train and gets delivered to an inland point without a shorter truck trip in between. So that saves some more energy and emissions. Getting right to the border of land and sea, we have what's called shore power. And when a vessel, and the vast majority of vessels in the world's fleet today run on a form of diesel fuel, when that vessel gets to the dock and is docked there for some hours a day maybe while cargo is being unloaded, it still has to use energy. There's onboard systems, there's dozens of people on the ship that need to eat, sleep, bathe. There are energy systems on board that ship. So the ship continues to burn diesel. What you can do is plug the ship into the shoreside electric grid. And that way it stops burning diesel while it's at the dock and uses electricity instead. That has tremendous benefits for the local air quality and can really be a huge benefit to local communities. One shore power system for one dock and one ship costs about $20 million. That's a lot of money, and that doesn't even take into account all the electricity that will need to be generated at a utility and the transmission line that will bring that electricity to the shore. So for all but the largest ports in the country, they don't have $20 million to spend to build a system like that when the ships don't even have the components on board to plug into that electricity. But nevertheless, it's increasingly becoming very popular. Shipbuilders are retrofitting their ships to plug into shore power, and it's fast developing. There are ports around the country that are examining this. Last step, getting to the vessels. Now, it was mentioned, ocean-going vessels, maritime transportation emits about 3% of the world's CO2 every year. If we're going to mitigate that, if we're going to eliminate that, you need to generate zero-emission fuel. Hydrogen, ammonia, methanol are often described as leading contenders. To create zero-emission hydrogen, you go through a process called electrolysis, which is where you run electricity through water, separate hydrogen from oxygen. Now you have hydrogen, which you could run a ship on. To generate that hydrogen to run the ships, we will need orders of magnitude more electricity than is currently being produced today. All of that electricity will need to get to a hydrogen production plant, which ideally would be in a coastal location nearby where the fuel will be loaded onto the ship. So to get to a point where we can start to have zero-emission shipping in this country, we are going to need to fund more electric grid infrastructure. We're going to need to incentivize hydrogen and other alternative fuel production, which thankfully has been done through the Inflation Reduction Act. And we're going to need to improve our permitting processes because it takes years and years to permit new transmission lines, and it just doesn't happen on the timescale that will be necessary for this decarbonization journey. So all of that said, there's no reason why this can't be done in the United States. There's no reason why the United States can't be the world leader in alternative fuels and port decarbonization. So that's the lens I think we look at it at the American Association of Port Authorities is our maritime industry is creating jobs, creating economic development, and as this industry starts to look at the future and the way forward, let's make it American and let's be the world leader.
Very well said. That was fantastic. Yeah, and as I was sort of listening to all of the comments here, one sort of thread that I think I've heard is really also around sort of the benefits to communities, and I think that's always an important lens through which we need to see any challenge that we're facing in the world. Is how is it going to impact local people who often have a much bigger stake in the outcomes? And so if we're talking about new fuels, are they going to be safe for local communities? Are people comfortable? And how can we both move with speed and urgency, right? And you referenced sort of how long it takes to get projects permitted, and yet at the same time, make sure that we take the time to have that engagement with communities that are often most impacted, both by climate change, but also then potentially by the solutions if we haven't really thought it through. And you made the point very well, Commander, about the need to look ahead to unintended impacts, and we really do want to make sure that we're being thoughtful about that. Great, so we've got a few minutes left, and I'd love to maybe ask a quick question about green corridors, and then I've got a few questions from the audience here that I'll maybe synthesize a few and toss a few of these your way, but thank you folks for providing some questions for us to chew on. So this topic of green corridors is something that in the maritime industry is sort of a buzz. There are all kinds of green corridor initiatives being announced all around the world, and there's a lot of debate about what those should look like, what is green enough, what is the right way to set such initiatives up, but sort of fundamentally what that means in this space is getting a value chain in a place aligned, fostering some coordination, some collaboration, some incentives, very important government incentives, get private sector alignment so that you have things like a chain of offtake, right? Offtake sounds maybe a little boring, but it's actually tremendously important because that's what helps make the business case across that value chain for adoption of things like new fuels and technologies. So the vision is sort of, how can we either in a certain geography or using a certain bunkering hub as a center of gravity for that kind of multi-stakeholder collaboration in a place so that we can take this really massive, complex global challenge and kind of boil it down to a hopefully slightly simpler, space-based, not space, like not that kind of space, that's a different thing, different problem, but sort of a place-based challenge and set of opportunities. So would love any of you who would like to reflect on, what might be some of the benefits of a green corridor approach. If any of you are involved in certain green corridor initiatives and have any sort of thoughts about what you think might be working, or what may be some ways that we can harness that concept to move things forward here in the United States.
Well, Lee, you mentioned some of your members are afraid to pick the wrong fuel, right? What if we pick a fuel, build a ship to run on it, and then can't find the fuel? Then we have what's called a stranded asset. That's the big problem. Everybody's afraid, what if I pick hydrogen and then the whole world decides to run on methanol instead? So what a green corridor can really solve is you get, say, Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Shanghai, one of the busiest routes in the world, and get those two port authorities talking to each other and say, let's agree on a fuel to you. Let's produce the same fuel at both ends of this route. And then all of the carriers that are running cargo on that route have some certainty. They go, I'm going to continue my operations. I know at both ends of this busy route that I can make money on. We'll have the fuel I need, and they can have some surety when they build that new vessel.
And as a regulator, we really appreciate that, because we can learn on a much smaller scale and understand how this is impacting ship systems and if any marine casualties are happening as a result.
Yeah, and as a ship builder and owner, as you said, the collaboration is necessary in order to make those investments in our assets. As Lee said, these are 20, 30 plus year assets that are, quite frankly, very expensive. And so putting those funds into these new technologies requires a collaboration across multiple parties in order to agree on a pathway forward that allows us to decarbonize in a sustainable way.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've at the Aspen Institute, we've been involved in a number of the green corridor initiatives as advisors. Sometimes we help bring the cargo owner voice. Again, somebody's got to pay the bill for greener shipping, and so we help educate and get them engaged. And one thing that I've noticed and have pointed out to folks a few times is this tension between collaboration and competition, because often in those places you have fierce competition among service providers. And so how can we create just the right collaboration approach that harnesses the benefits of competition while also allowing for that kind of collaboration where we can actually agree on how to move forward together, agree on how to share costs, agree on how to reduce one another's risks, and sort of, the analogy I like is hold hands and leap together. Sometimes you got to hold hands with someone you've been fiercely competing with and do that, consistent with competition law. So, there are a lot of fun challenges that certainly get me up, bright and bushy-tailed every morning. But the hope is that green corridors can help address a number of those challenges. So thanks for pointing to that. So we've got a few more minutes, and we've got a few questions here. So we'll try to get to as many as we can. One question is around, so we are working on a number of new fuels, lower and zero emission fuels. And the question here is around the need or role for ocean data and data products to help reduce port congestion and increase efficiency. And probably even then, I would add to that, if I may, to that question, also once we have the new fuels, for folks who are paying a premium for a cleaner shipping service, they want to make sure that the right fuels got used, and how were those fuels produced, and in what quantities were they used, so that if they are paying a premium, they know that they're able to get a credible and appropriate emissions reduction. And so what does the industry need in terms of digitalization, in terms of better data products? And is there a role for government in helping advance that really important element of decarbonization? Any thoughts?
I think data is just looking at how much more data is available. I think just collaboration. We talk a lot about unity of effort. If the private sector has a great product or there are ways to share data, I think we definitely need to explore them. It's really important to the Coast Guard to make sure that we provide as much marine safety data as possible to the maritime public.
Yeah, and as far as digitalization goes, that's something that Crowley focuses on for innovation, being able to have the data to improve our efficiency. We're already using that in order to, arrive just in time to the ports so that there's no idle time for our vessels to be able to slow down, to increase fuel efficiencies, but still make our windows that are required for our customer deliveries. Those are the types of things that data can help improve. And then being able to have that validation of data to prove the effectiveness of alternative fuels, to be able to confirm to our customers, yes, you are saving on emissions, you are being more green in your shipping by using these alternative fuel methods and alternative methods of transportation.
Well, thinking about within a port, within a harbor, as an analogy, think about when you go on a road trip, the efficiency you get from a GPS system on your phone or in your car versus having a paper map in the car. If you have a paper map, maybe I get lost. I need to pull over, look at the map. Which way am I going? I'm lost. If I have GPS, I know where I'm going. It's much easier. If I have a weather app, there's going to be a big rainstorm. Why don't I wait it out and arrive later? It's the same thing for the maritime industry. I'll give a shout out to the NOAA Ports program, which is a robust data system that gives port authorities and ship operators the data they need on bathymetry, which is the depth of the water, ocean currents, presence of marine mammals, weather, wind. All of that data helps you plan an efficient arrival at a port.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Ian, and actually something that we're doing internally with my team for sustainability is mapping our operational footprint against these biologically important areas to look at our impact and make sure that we are promoting ocean health and biodiversity. So thank you for,
Yeah, that's great. And when we think about other impacts of the maritime industry, which isn't the focus of this, but I sort of had made the point up at the beginning that it'd be great if we're already going through this massive transition and making all these investments. Let's go ahead and address issues like, is there more we could do on ocean noise, for example? Is there more that we could do to reduce marine mammal interactions? There are a number of is there more we could do for collecting data for basic ocean research? I think there's probably a lot of potential here that just requires more collaborative discussion and identifying some pathways forward, and hopefully coming together as a diverse group of stakeholders to actually, request that our policymakers help us with the right level of investment specifically dedicated to maritime, so that we can have a fast and efficient transition that also includes proper stakeholder engagement and is able to seize these many benefits of a potential transition. So we've got one more question here. I'm going to ask this one because I think people have seen in the press some coverage probably of some of the new vessels that have sail. So there's something very poetic about sail, going back to sail, and I don't think anyone's expecting that all of your Amazon boxes are going to be arriving by old-fashioned, there's too many pirate jokes in this space, so I'm going to resist the temptation. But there is actually some really interesting stuff happening in sail technology in terms of efficiency gains. And so we'd love to, anyone who's got sort of anything to share on that, which has gotten so much attention and I think could really have some interesting benefits in terms of reducing our fuel usage, both fossil fuels and those more expensive clean fuels, which we are going to have to use efficiently. So there are some opportunities and challenges there, but if anyone wants to help illuminate some of that to our audience.
I get the pleasure of seeing some of these projects as they are rolling out, and it's really unique, and I think that collaboration is what we need to move forward. If we're not trying new things, we're just going to be the same maritime industry we have always been. So just even having a Coast Guard speaker here, I think is huge. I've been in the maritime industry for roughly 20 years, and this is the first opportunity that I've had to have a science and transportation type event. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Any thoughts on sail? Crowley sail ships coming soon? Maybe. Well, I think it is quite exciting, and people talk about how, well, why would we harness the wind with turbines, turn it into electricity, turn that electricity into hydrogen, and then the hydrogen into something else, and then put that in the tank of a ship and then go across the ocean when we can just harness the wind to go across the ocean. So a lot of interesting potential there, and so keep your eyes on those interesting announcements as they come out. Great, so we're just about wrapping up in time, and thank you folks. If I didn't get to your question, I apologize, but they're all very good, and I'll be sure to show them to our panelists afterward as well. But as we come to the end of our time, I just wanted to, first of all, give you all a chance, if there's any closing point, something that you really wanted to make here that you didn't have a chance to, feel free to jump in and do that. But if not, I did want to point out a few things. So we talked about efficiency, we talked about new fuels, some of the opportunities and challenges, and a real opportunity for the United States to be a leader, a thought leader, a leader in research and development, revitalization of our shipbuilding industry. There's fuel production, so much that we can do in this space that we need to keep that optimistic viewpoint and really seize the opportunity to work together across sectors, across viewpoints, across parties, to advance something that could be quite beneficial. And it's not to say that it'll be easy. This is hard work, but there's so much potential benefit that I'm just so pleased that we've had a chance to talk about it here today. And some of the challenges that the industry faces that we've talked about here today are things that I think we should all walk away asking ourselves, how can we create better regulatory certainty for this transition? Because the idea of stranded assets is terrifying. Imagine you have taken all the hard work, you're a company, and you make a major investment, and then that is not the right investment. This is the kind of scenario that we want to avoid. So how can we create certainty? How can we reduce risk? How can we close that cost gap? And what is the role of our government at various levels, all the way from the IMO at the global level, down to a port authority and local government level, to helping create the right incentives? The importance of demand and taking some of the lessons that we've learned from the fisheries and seafood space, using that for maritime cargo, freight transport, and then also those lessons going back to that fisheries and seafood community that now, we hope will be ready soon to embark on its own decarbonization adventure. And so all of this leads me to conclude that what we really need is a comprehensive national maritime decarbonization strategy. So hopefully we'll get there at some point, but we do need a clear pathway to how we're going to meet those objectives as a nation and make sure that we seize the benefits so that we can continue to have a healthy economy, so that we can protect the health of local communities and people, and so that we can continue to have a strong maritime transport and fisheries industry that is also safe. So with that, I would like to thank our panelists so very much for your time and this lovely conversation, and turn it back to Shannon.
Thank you, Ingrid, and thank you to our entire panel. That is an amazing conversation about balance and about collaboration and about the work that we need ahead of us. And I think it is great to see that maritime transportation industry, that entire sector, really coming together through public-private partnerships, a lot of the leadership that you guys and others are demonstrating. And ultimately also talking about how can we make sure we are including the right people in those conversations. And that is a huge piece that we still have to make sure that we are all doing our part in, and I appreciate the emphasis on that. And certainly the call for the comprehensive national decarbonization strategy for all of those policymakers who are looking for something, all of our partners, call that one out for folks. So thank you. We're going to take a short break, but we're going to be back here again at 3 o'clock for our closing plenary, the Margaret Davidson Emerging Leaders session, which is really focusing on how are we bringing together those climate disruptors, those innovation accelerators, and those wave makers who are looking to make the biggest difference and close out Capitol Ocean Week with a bang. You don't want to miss it. Thank you.